Selam, an image, an idol, a shape made by human hands, and then feared as though it could judge the living. Tonight, weary soul, we are not entering a familiar Bible story. We are entering a night most listeners have never been taken into slowly. A night from the Ethiopian Bible. A night from the book of Meqabyan. A night where a king who loves sin raises false images over his people. Where faithful men are dragged toward torment. And where the darkness does not end when the flames go down. Because before morning comes, the dead will stand beside the bed of the man who ordered their suffering. That is where we are going tonight. Not into rumor. Not into theatrical religion. Into a chapter with teeth. Into a chapter that keeps its hand around the throat of the night. Until even a king cannot hide inside sleep. I'm Pastor Michael, and tonight I want to sound close to you. Not polished and distant. Not like a man performing mystery. Like a pastor sitting nearby in the late hour, opening an old Ethiopian witness with careful hands, and telling you the part that would not let him go. What would not let me go is this. One Meqabyan does not treat evil like scenery. It does not glance at cruelty and move on. It walks us into the room. It lets us feel what kind of kingdom is formed when worship is corrupted. When power begins telling the soul where it must bow, and when righteous men decide that even pain is better than kneeling before what is hollow. So, tonight we are going to walk through the darkest chapter of Meqabyan as the Ethiopian Bible preserves it. We will begin with the king whose heart has already gone rotten. We will watch the pressure of idolatry harden into violence. We will come to the fire. And then, we will come to the part most people never expect, when the chapter follows that violence into the king's own chamber after nightfall. And that is the strange mercy of this old text. It refuses to let wickedness feel settled. It refuses to let the ruler appear larger than judgment. It refuses to let the night belong to the wrong man. So stay close. For a few moments, we must make sure we are standing in the right book. Because once we do, the first name this chapter gives us will darken everything that follows. Before we meet the king, we need one clean lantern in the hand. Because if the title says Meqabyan and the listener hears ordinary Maccabees, then the mind steps into the wrong corridor. And the wrong corridor weakens the whole night. So hear this carefully. The Meqabyan books of the Ethiopian Bible are not simply the familiar Greek books of Maccabees read with a different pronunciation. They belong to a different preserved stream. Their names may sound related. Their narrative world is not the same. That matters tonight because suspense dies when orientation is muddy. And I do not want mud in the first movement of this script. I want the road beneath you to feel clear. There is a particular kind of disappointment that happens in long-form narration when the listener clicks for one promise and slowly realizes they are being taken through something else. We are not going to do that. We are going to lock the promise early. You clicked for the darkest chapter of Meqabyan. That is exactly what we are opening. Not a substitute story. Not a generic lesson about hidden books. Not a drift into broad manuscript talk before the blood of the chapter has even reached the page. We are in the Ethiopian Bible. We are in one Meqabyan, and we are moving toward a ruler named Tserutsedan, a man introduced not with ambiguity, but with moral exposure. The Ethiopian Christian tradition kept these books under the name Meqabyan, and that preservation matters. Because texts like these did not survive as floating curiosities. They survived because communities remembered them, received them, placed them, and kept hearing them inside a living canon. One of the names connected with canon framing in Ethiopian tradition is Feteha Negest. In Ge'ez Christian usage, That title means Law of the Kings, and I think there is something fitting in that tonight, because we are about to enter a story where kingship itself becomes part of the judgment. A book named inside a world of sacred order, and inside it, a ruler whose own order has become diseased. The word used here is Meqabyan. In English discussion, people often flatten it too quickly into Maccabees and assume they already know the emotional furniture of the story. But historically, the Meqabyan books in Ethiopian tradition are distinct from the Greek and Latin Maccabean books many other Christians know. And tonight, that matters, because if you think this chapter is heading toward a familiar revolt summary, you will miss the peculiar severity of what actually arrives. And I will tell you honestly, I think many listeners have never had anyone slow down enough to make that distinction feel alive. That is why I am beginning here. Not because the canon question is more exciting than the story. It is not. The story is stronger. But because a good guide does not hurry you into the dark without first telling you which door has opened. So now the door is named. And I want to give you one more reason this matters for retention of the heart. Meqabyan is not compelling because it is obscure. Obscurity by itself is cheap. A buried title does not deserve our attention just because it is buried. What gives a hidden text weight is whether it contains something morally and spiritually alive when opened. And one Meqabyan does. It contains an old conflict that still feels close enough to breathe on us. What happens when power stops being satisfied with obedience and begins demanding reverence? What happens when a kingdom no longer wants your service only, but your worship? What happens when refusal stops being philosophical and starts becoming dangerous? Those are not dead questions. Those are permanent questions. That is why this chapter still has heat. Not loud heat, not sensational heat. The slow heat of moral pressure. The kind that makes a listener lean in rather than drift away. And this is where I want to be especially careful. Some hidden text storytelling loses its audience by spending too long congratulating itself for being hidden. But hiddenness is not the point. The point is what the text does once we hear it. The point is whether the chapter keeps tightening around one clear line of tension. This one does. A king loves sin. A kingdom is filled with false images. Faithful men refuse. Violence follows. Then the night answers back. You can feel already how clean that movement is. It gives the tired mind something solid to hold. Not 20 ideas. Not a lecture disguised as atmosphere. A story rail. And story rails protect attention. The soul rests better when it knows where the voice is taking it. So let us keep the rail in view. We are not touring the whole Ethiopian canon tonight, though that larger house matters. We are not standing long in broad comparison, though comparison is useful. We are walking toward one chapter, one throne, one demand, one refusal, one fire, and one bedchamber after dark. And before we go farther, weary soul, let me ask you something softly. What name from tonight's text do you think will stay with you when the story is done? And if these late-night journeys through old scripture are becoming part of your rest, a quiet subscribe keeps them near. Now, back to the text, because the first great shadow cast over this chapter does not come from the flames. It comes from the man seated before them, the man whose appetite has already shaped the kingdom, the man the text refuses to flatter, the man whose name enters like a dark nail driven into the wood of the story. Cherut Seidan. Remember it, because what comes next does not begin with his violence. It begins with his love, and that is what makes the chapter truly dangerous. There are introductions in sacred writing that unfold slowly, letting a person gather complexity line by line. And then there are introductions that strike like iron, One Meqabyan chooses iron. It gives us Teirut Sedan, with a sentence that leaves almost no shelter around him. He loved sin. That is not casual wording. It is not decorative harshness. It is diagnosis. The text does not merely say that he committed evil acts. It tells us what his heart leaned toward, what he welcomed, what he savored, what he did not merely tolerate, but loved. And when a ruler loves what is crooked, his kingdom eventually begins to take on the shape of that love. That is how the darkness enters this chapter. Not first through fire, not first through screams, first through delight in the wrong thing, first through a throne whose center has already tilted away from God. This is why I do not want to rush past the sentence, because many listeners hear "wicked king" and think they already know the script. But one Meqabyan is more exact than that. A wicked act can be sudden. A wicked policy can be strategic. But a man who loves sin is something deeper. He is inwardly allied with corruption. He does not merely perform darkness. He feels at home in it. And from that inward alliance, the next feature of the chapter rises naturally. Idolatry. Images. Visible objects around which fear can be organized. The opening word returns here with force. Telem. Image. A likeness made by hands. A false center. A constructed thing pretending to carry ultimate claim. What the king wants is not art. He wants submission. He wants the people surrounded by visible reminders that power has chosen the shape of worship. He wants reverence managed. He wants fear directed. He wants the public world arranged so that the soul feels pressure from every side. And that is what makes this chapter feel so alive, even now. Because false worship is never only about statues. It is about what human beings decide must not be questioned. It is about what gets raised high, what gets normalized, what gets praised, until refusal begins to look like treason. The idol is the visible surface. The deeper issue is spiritual control. The word used here is Teirut Sedan. The text presents him as a ruler, swollen with pride and idolatrous power. In the English source preserved on Wikisource, he appears at the opening of 1 Meqabyan as a man who loved sin and was bound up with idols. Historically, this matters because 1 Meqabyan belongs to a distinct Ethiopian textual tradition, not simply to the better-known Greek Maccabean histories. And tonight, that matters because the darkness of this chapter is not generic tyranny. It is tyranny expressed through corrupted worship. And I will tell you, honestly, this part always makes me listen more carefully than I expected to. Because many rulers in history have wanted obedience, but the most dangerous ones always want something closer to adoration. That is the atmosphere now. Not yet the fire, not yet the bodily violence, but the atmosphere that makes such violence possible. A court arranged around false devotion. A ruler who prefers what he can display and control. A people taught, little by little, what must be feared and what must be praised. This is how moral climates work. Cruelty is rarely born at full volume. It often begins in repeated symbols, in tolerated arrogance, in public gestures, in the slow training of a society to call hollow things holy. That is why this section matters so much for average view duration of the story. If we skip the climate, we cheapen the cost. If we skip the inward rot, then the later suffering becomes noise instead of revelation. But if we understand what the king wants, then every coming scene tightens properly. The chapter becomes inevitable in the most terrible way. Imagine the court for a moment. Not wildly chaotic. That would almost be easier. No, imagine it ordered. Attendants moving in patterns. Reports being carried. Commands delivered in practiced tones. Light falling across the surfaces of crafted images, people measuring their expressions, people learning which gestures keep them safe. That is the chill. Evil wrapped in administration. Blasphemy seated comfortably. A kingdom acting as though the arrangement is stable, because the arrangement is official. And somewhere under that official calm are the faithful. Not yet center stage. Not yet in the king's hands. But already in the path of collision. Because every system of false worship reaches a moment when it must expose itself. It cannot remain symbolic forever. Soon it must ask the body to do what the conscience cannot do. Soon it must force the knee. Soon it must demand public surrender. That is when the masks come off. That is when the chapter sharpens. This is the line I want to keep bright in your mind. The darkest part of the chapter is not only that men suffer, it is that a ruler tries to seize the place in human life that belongs to God alone. Once that attempt is made, violence is never far behind, because idols cannot persuade like truth can. They require enforcement. False gods are always defended by nervous power. They need threats because they have no breath. And that is why old sacred texts are so merciless toward proud rulers. They know the pattern. A man raises what he can control. He demands reverence for it. He grows angry when the righteous remain upright. Then he discovers, too late, that he can wound the body without owning the soul. We are not at that discovery yet. Not quite. For now, the chapter is still gathering storm. The king is still above ground, still seated, still certain, still surrounded by the machinery of fear. He believes the order he has made will hold. He believes his images can command the inward life of the people. He believes night itself will one day close over his deeds and let him sleep untouched. But the text is already preparing the listener to distrust his certainty. That is one of the great pleasures of hearing a severe old chapter read slowly. You can feel judgment approaching before the king does. You can hear the floorboards of the story begin to answer his weight. You can sense that the chapter is not building toward his triumph, but toward his exposure. Still, before the exposure comes the cost. Before the bedchamber comes the binding. Before the haunting comes the test. And the next movement is where the chapter stops describing evil from the throne outward and begins narrowing toward the faithful men who refuse to bow. Keep close now, because the darkness is about to move from images to bodies. And once that happens, this chapter will never sound distant again. A wicked king is dangerous, but a wicked king who teaches a people how to worship falsely. That is darker still, because now evil is no longer confined to appetite. It is arranged, displayed, repeated, installed in the public eye until the lie begins to feel ordinary. This is where one Meqabyan deepens its shadow. Tse Rutse Dan is not content to adore corruption privately. He wants a kingdom shaped by it. He wants false reverence given structure. He wants symbols planted where consciences must keep saying them. He wants the visible world to preach for him. And that is one reason this chapter remains so unsettling. The text understands something human beings keep learning the hard way. People do not drift into darkness only through argument. They drift through repetition, through atmosphere, through public habits that slowly train the body before the soul knows how much has already been surrendered. Picture the kingdom under that pressure. Not chaos. That would at least announce itself. No. Imagine order. Roads still traveled. Markets still speaking. Servants still moving. Children still hearing the language of daily life. And above all of it, images, raised forms, visible claims, silent demands, the kind of things people are meant to pass by and understand without words. This is what power honors. This is what safety requires. This is what the room expects. That is how spiritual coercion often works. It begins by occupying space. It puts itself where the eye cannot avoid it. It dares the faithful to remain inwardly whole, while standing inside a world designed to thin their resistance. The word used here is tselem, and in Hebrew thought, tselem means image, a likeness, a representation, a form that points beyond itself. That matters because in the oldest biblical imagination, image language is not neutral. Human beings themselves bear the image of God in Genesis. But here, under the weight of idolatry, image is twisted. Instead of humanity reflecting the living God, dead forms demand living fear. Historically, that inversion belongs to one of the deepest patterns in Scripture. Idolatry takes what should be a sign and makes it a rival. And tonight that matters because Tserutsaidon's kingdom is not merely decorating its power, it is reassigning reverence. And I will tell you honestly, I think that is one reason the chapter feels heavier the longer you sit with it. The evil here is not random rage. It is counterfeit worship made civic. You can feel how dangerous that becomes. Because once false worship enters the architecture of public life, refusal starts to look hostile. The righteous are no longer treated as men who simply choose another loyalty. They begin to look like threats to social peace. Their steadiness embarrasses the lie. Their stillness exposes the panic underneath the system. And proud men cannot bear to be exposed by the quiet. That is why the chapter does not rush. It lets the kingdom darken first. It shows us the climate before the storm breaks. That is good storytelling. And it is truthful theology too. Cruelty rarely erupts without preparation. First the symbols are accepted. Then the gestures are expected. Then the questions become dangerous. Then the bodies are taken. This is how a throne teaches fear. Not only by punishment, but by making people rehearse surrender before punishment is needed. A ruler like Tserutsaidon wants the people to learn bowing early, so that when violence finally appears, it will feel like the natural answer to refusal. And yet that plan contains its own weakness. Because idols have to be defended, truth does not. The living God does not need guards around his being. But false gods are nervous things. They are fragile centers. They depend on performance. They require enforcement because they cannot command love on their own. That is why bad power becomes theatrical. It is always compensating for emptiness. The court of Tserutsaidon would have carried that nervousness even when it looked polished. Attendants would have learned to speak in safe phrases. Officials would have watched faces. Those nearest the throne would have become experts in emotional weather. Who hesitated? Who bowed late? Who looked away too long? Who still carried some inward loyalty that had not yet been captured? That is the suffocating brilliance of a kingdom of images. It makes visible conformity feel like survival. It turns the public square into a test. It makes reverence measurable. And once reverence becomes measurable, the righteous are already in danger. Because the righteous cannot live forever at the edge of that system without being forced into visibility. Sooner or later, faithfulness becomes noticeable. Sooner or later, a household does not bow. A man refuses the gesture. A woman does not speak the expected praise. A family keeps an allegiance that no image can absorb. And once that happens, false worship shows its teeth. This is where the chapter begins tightening the wire. For a few moments longer, we are still in atmosphere, still in moral climate, still in the broad shadow of the kingdom. But the text is already preparing us for collision, because images are never the end point. They are instruments. They are tools for testing who can be compelled. They are bait for conscience. That is why I want to say this plainly. The darkness of this chapter is not only in what the king does later, it is in what he is building now. A world in which the holy must kneel before the hollow. A world in which the visible arrangement is treated as final reality. A world in which power believes it can tutor the soul. And still, there are limits to what power can teach. It can train the body in fear. It can pressure the mouth. It can surround the eye. But it cannot generate worship from the heart. At best, it can counterfeit consent. And old sacred texts know the difference. They always know the difference. This is why the faithful matter so much in the next movement. Not because they are loud, not because they stage a dramatic rebellion for its own sake, but because they quietly reveal the boundary of evil. There is a point beyond which a righteous soul simply will not go. There is a line that cannot be crossed without becoming false to God. And once the king discovers that line exists, he will answer it with force. Before we move there, let us stay one breath longer with the unease of the kingdom itself. Imagine walking its roads at evening. Imagine hearing ordinary sounds beneath extraordinary pressure. A seller closing his stall, a mother gathering a child, a servant carrying water, a soldier posted near some visible image of authority. The whole place functioning, the whole place outwardly stable, and yet beneath the surface, a question moving from house to house. How long before obedience is no longer enough? How long before the king asks for what belongs only to God? That is the real suspense here. Not whether the kingdom is dark. We already know that. The suspense is where the darkness will land. Who will be made to prove loyalty? Which household will be forced into the open? Which names will now become costly to bear? And the answer, when it comes, will not come to strangers without faces. The chapter narrows next. It leaves the broad field of public imagery and enters the intimate field of faithful refusal. That is when the story becomes harder to escape. Because once we are no longer speaking of a system in general, we will be speaking of men the king can seize. Men whose flesh can be struck. Men whose loyalty can be tested under pain. So hold the atmosphere in your mind. The kingdom of images, the managed reverence, the polished emptiness, the nervous throne. All of it matters, because the next scene is not random suffering. It is the inevitable collision between counterfeit worship and a faithful house that will not bend. And when that house finally comes into view, you will hear something the king does not yet understand. That quiet refusal can trouble a throne more deeply than open war. Every kingdom of lies eventually collides with a household that will not repeat them. That is where this chapter turns, from atmosphere into wound. Not yet the fire, not yet the full cruelty, but the moment the king's system meets a conscience it cannot quietly absorb. Up to now, we have stood under the shadow of Tse Rutse Dan's public power. We have watched the kingdom fill with visible pressure. Now the text begins drawing our eyes toward the faithful, toward the men who do not treat worship as negotiable, toward the house that discovers, in a terrible hour, that saying no to an idol is not merely a belief, it is an exposure. The English rendering of one Meqabyan gives us names that matter here. Maccabeus appears in the book as a man from the tribe of Benjamin. Later in the narrative, faithful figures such as Abia, Sela, and Phantos stand out under persecution. And that matters because old sacred stories become heavier when they refuse to leave righteousness anonymous. A nameless crowd can be admired from a distance, but once names enter, the suffering starts to breathe. The listener is no longer dealing with abstract virtue. The listener is hearing about men who can be called, seized, bound, and remembered. The word used here is Benjamin. In scripture, Benjamin names both a son of Jacob and the tribe that came from him. In English, the name is often understood as son of the right hand. Historically, the tribe of Benjamin carries a long and complicated memory inside Israel's story. Royal memory, near destruction, survival, and identity under pressure. And tonight that matters. Because when one Meqabyan locates Maccabeus in Benjamin, it gives the figure a place in Israel's remembered body. He is not floating in myth detached from sacred history. He stands inside an old covenant lineage. And I will tell you honestly, there is something about that detail that keeps me from hearing these men as symbols only. They feel placed, rooted, accountable to a memory larger than the king who threatens them. That rootedness is important, because false worship always tries to make the faithful feel isolated. It wants them to think they are small, odd, out of step, alone in their refusal. But the righteous are rarely as alone as power wants them to feel. They stand inside older promises. They inherit older loyalties. They are upheld by truths that were not born in the tyrant's generation and will not die with it. I imagine this faithful house under growing pressure, not heroic in a theatrical sense, not eager for pain, not trying to become legends, just men who know where worship belongs, men who understand that once the knee bends in the wrong direction, something deeper than safety is lost. That is what makes their refusal so arresting. It is not built on spectacle. It is built on clarity. And clarity has a strange power in dark stories. It steadies the whole script. The king may be loud. The system may be heavy. But when the righteous know what they cannot do, the narrative suddenly has a center. That is why audiences stay with a chapter like this. The moral line is clean enough to follow, even in a tired state. The heart recognizes the shape of the conflict. The faithful here are not merely resisting policy. They are refusing liturgical theft. They are refusing to hand over to images what belongs to the living God. That is why their no carries such weight. The chapter is not presenting them as political contrarians. It is presenting them as guardians of rightful worship. They are protecting reality from distortion, even if their own bodies will pay the price. This is where I want to slow the narration just a little more, because in many retellings, refusal can sound instant and effortless, as though brave people never feel the air tighten around them. But old faith is rarely that shallow. I think these men felt the pressure. I think they knew what kind of ruler they were refusing. I think they understood what happens when public power decides to make an example of a smaller body. And still they stood. That is one of the reasons I find this reading so moving. Not because the faithful are fearless machines, but because their loyalty is weight-bearing. It is loyalty under knowledge. They are not refusing in innocence. They are refusing with enough understanding to know that punishment is coming. And perhaps that is why the chapter feels more human than some listeners expect. Its holiness is not glori. It stands inside dread. We should also notice how the king's system would perceive such men. To a ruler like Tserutsedan, a faithful house is not merely inconvenient. It is intolerable, because it reveals the boundary of his sovereignty. As long as everyone bows, his world appears complete. But when a few remain upright, the whole illusion trembles. Their refusal says there is still a throne above his throne. Their stillness says there is a judgment he cannot manage. Their loyalty says his kingdom is not ultimate. And for proud men, that is unbearable. So the chapter narrows further. We are moving now from atmosphere to target, from system to victims, from symbols in the public square to bodies the state can touch. The king can no longer be satisfied with broad pressures. He must make his point on living flesh. He must show the people what happens when conscience refuses choreography. That is the terrible logic of idolatrous power. When it cannot persuade, it punishes. When it cannot win reverence, it stages fear. When it cannot command the soul, it strikes the body and hopes the watching crowd will learn obedience. The names Abia, Sila, and Fentos therefore matter more than they first seem to, whether the listener remembers every detail or not. Those names signal something crucial. God sees persons, where tyrants see examples. The king wants bodies to display his supremacy. The text gives us men with names, men whose witness will outlast the machinery built against them. That is a sacred reversal. If the names are not first received with dignity, then the suffering can sound like mere dark content. But this chapter is not dark content. It is a witness. It is asking whether the holy can remain holy under pressure. And through these men, it answers yes. At terrible cost, but yes. Imagine the moment before seizure. No dramatic slow motion. Only the inward knowledge that the refusal has been noticed. Only the tightening of time. Only the sense that now the kingdom will move from expectation to enforcement. There is something deeply human in that threshold. The final ordinary breath before suffering begins. The final exchange of looks. The final silence in which each man knows he cannot go back and choose a smaller loyalty. That threshold may be one of the darkest edges of the whole chapter, because it is the place where faithfulness is no longer safe, but has not yet become glorious. It is simply exposed. And exposed faith is one of the most painful things to witness, honestly. No triumph yet. No vindication yet. Only the cost drawing near. That is where we are standing now. At the edge of arrest. At the edge of contact. At the edge of the king reaching from image to body. The chapter has done its work well. It has shown us the diseased throne. It has shown us the faithful house. Now it is ready to bring them together. And when it does, there will be no more distance. No more speaking of evil as a climate only. The next movement is where the hands of power close. Where the righteous are taken. Where the road itself begins to feel like an instrument of judgment. So keep their names near you now. This old Ethiopian chapter will stop circling the cost and begin to lay its hand directly upon it. There is a point in every severe sacred story when the listener realizes the danger is no longer theoretical. This is that point. The pressure that hovered over the chapter now takes shape in movement. Orders become pursuit. Suspicion becomes contact. The king's hatred reaches outward, and the road itself becomes part of the fear. The sources around one Meqabyan preserve the sense of a chase, a taking, a confrontation in which the faithful are no longer merely men who refuse privately, but bodies the ruler once brought under his hand. That matters because the story now leaves the inward space of conviction and enters the outer space of seizure. And once the state touches the body, its true theology is exposed. What does a tyrant believe about the human person? That is always the question beneath persecution. A ruler like Cherutsedan believes the body is enough. Enough to frighten, enough to break, enough to display, enough to turn into a sermon for everybody else. He believes pain can do the work truth could not do. That is why the seizure matters. It is his doctrine in motion. The text gives us mountain imagery around this phase, and that is worth hearing slowly. Mountains in scripture often carry revelation. Height, nearness to God, places of vantage and testing. But here the mountain road darkens. It becomes the path along which the faithful are seen, followed, cornered, and drawn toward violence. Even the geography starts feeling morally charged. The high place is no longer simply elevated. It is exposed. That exposure is painful to imagine, because the road is not yet the courtroom, not yet the place of formal sentence, not yet the final site of torture. It is the in-between place, the place where freedom is leaving, but pain has not fully arrived. And those in-between places are often where the human heart suffers most acutely, because the mind still has enough room to imagine what may be coming. The word used here is Gehenna. In the English rendering of 1 Meqabyan, the text associates the king's cruelty and Satan's desire with dragging souls toward torment. In later biblical and Christian usage, Gehenna becomes a word for judgment, destruction, and the place of terrible loss. Historically, the term grows out of the Valley of Hinnom near Jerusalem, a place that gathered fearful associations in Jewish memory. And tonight that matters because the chapter does not portray persecution as mere politics. It frames the violence within a larger moral horizon. The road is not only leading toward human punishment, it opens beneath a conflict that touches judgment itself. And I will tell you honestly, that is part of what makes this chapter feel so heavy in the late hour. It does not let cruelty remain small. It sets it against eternity. Now imagine the faithful on that road. Perhaps they have already fled once. Perhaps they have already felt the king's net tightening. Perhaps every sound behind them has begun to carry possibility. The chapter gives us enough to sense pressure, resistance, and the terrifying transition from movement to capture. This is not yet the spectacle of punishment. It is the narrowing before it. The moment when distance collapses. The moment when power finally lays hold. And once laid hold of, the righteous become public meaning. That is what tyrants always try to do. They turn persons into warnings. They make bodies into announcements. They want the watching people to learn fear without needing separate instruction. The seizure says, this is what happens to refusal. This is what becomes of those who keep another allegiance. This is how the king teaches the crowd. But the text quietly resists that transformation. Even now, it will not let the faithful become mere objects. The narration keeps moral attention on who they are, not only on what is being done to them. That is why the story retains dignity, even when it grows brutal. It is not fascinated with pain for its own sake. It is watching what pain reveals about worship, power, and loyalty. There is another detail in the tradition around these scenes that deepens the atmosphere. The cry of the country people. The sense that ordinary men and women, rich and poor, sons and daughters, feel the tremor of what the king's violence will do to the land itself. That matters, because persecution in holy texts is never private for long. It enters a people's emotional weather. It changes how roads feel. It changes what parents fear. It changes what a village whispers after sunset. The seizure on the road is therefore not only an event, it is a signal to the whole country that the kingdom has crossed into open cruelty. And still, there is something almost unbearable in the simplicity of the faithful here. They do not suddenly become grand political actors. They remain what they were, men who would not bow, men who would not transfer worship, men whose bodies can now be dragged, but whose allegiance has not moved. That stillness under capture is one of the chapter's most piercing features. The king has succeeded in touching them. He has not succeeded in possessing them. The seizure becomes just a bridge to the torture, but it is more than that. It is the moment when the lie of power is first tested against embodied faithfulness. The ruler reaches out expecting compliance to follow contact. Instead, he discovers that nearness to violence does not automatically generate surrender. That discovery will make him harsher. That discovery will drive the chapter toward its next severity. Imagine the faces watching from a distance. No one needs to say much. The meaning is already spreading. The king has moved against the faithful. The road has become witness. The mountain has seen enough to know what is coming, and perhaps the faithful themselves know it too. Perhaps this is the last stretch of ground beneath their feet before blows, binding, and fire. It is here, more than anywhere yet, that the script must honor the human scale. Feet on earth, hands seized, breath shortened, dust disturbed, distance closing. The chapter is no longer an argument. It is contact. And contact changes the listener's body as well. We no longer hear safely from far away. We begin to feel the road narrowing around us. This is why high-retention storytelling always knows when to zoom in. Not more concepts here. Not more canon talk here. Here, the narrative must stay close to the capture, close to the fear, close to the fact that righteous men are being delivered into the reach of a kingdom already corrupted by false worship. That is what gives the coming scenes their force. The suffering will not arrive from nowhere. We have walked with it to the door, and now the door is almost opening. The king's hand is no longer symbolic. The faithful are no longer merely observed. The chapter is preparing to do what it promised from the beginning. Show what happens when idolatry hardens into punishment. One Meqabyan stops holding the violence at a distance. The men we have followed will be bound. The body will enter the chapter as a site of testimony. And the old text, without flinching and without cheapening the pain, will turn severe. So keep the road in your mind. The mountain air, the closing distance, the hands of power finally reaching. Because once we leave this path, we will enter the chamber where the chapter stops threatening suffering and begins to name it. There is a point in a sacred story when the air changes. You can hear it before you can explain it. The language tightens, the distance collapses, and what had been moving toward the body finally arrives there. This is that point in one Meqabyan. Until now, we have watched the chapter gather pressure. A king loves sin. A kingdom is shaped by images. A faithful house refuses. A road narrows. Hand seize. And now, the old text does something stern. It stops circling the cost and begins to lay it directly upon the flesh. This is where the script must slow down without becoming indulgent, because there is always a temptation, when a sacred text turns harsh, to speak too quickly and call that reverence. But speed can become a disguise. If we rush past the suffering, we accidentally help the tyrant. We make pain impersonal. We turn witness into blur. And one Meqabyan does not permit blur here. It wants the listener to understand what false worship becomes when persuasion fails. It becomes punishment. It becomes spectacle. It becomes bodily pressure, applied in the hope that the soul will finally give way. The righteous men are no longer only being threatened. They are handled, bound, struck, displayed under the will of a ruler who believes force can finish what idolatry began. That is the true severity of the scene. The king is not merely angry. He is catechizing through violence. He is trying to preach with blows. He is trying to teach the crowd that there is no difference between what the body can be made to do and what the heart truly worships. But holy texts know better. They know that pain can expose a person without owning him. They know that the body can be made to suffer, while the conscience remains uncolonized. And that is what makes this chapter so hard to hear, and so necessary to hear slowly. The cruelty is real. The surrender is not. The word that rises repeatedly in this book is Jah. In the English rendering of one Meqabyan, the faithful are described as servants of the Most High Jah. That matters because the name keeps the whole scene from collapsing into mere endurance. This is not suffering for stubbornness. This is not pain for the sake of reputation. It is loyalty ordered toward the living God. Historically, The use of this divine title in the English translation marks the text's religious intensity and keeps the martyrdom scene God-facing rather than self-facing. And tonight that matters, because once the punishments begin, the listener must not lose the true axis of the story. These men are not chiefly standing against a king. They are standing toward God. And I will tell you honestly, that difference changes everything in how I hear their pain. Without it, the chapter would only be cruel. With it, the chapter becomes witness. The old wording connected to these scenes is unsparing. The martyrs are beaten, whipped, broken down under a system that hopes enough suffering will produce compliance. The text even gives us language so stark, it almost startles the modern ear. That starkness has a purpose. It refuses to let persecution remain decorative. It will not let us call the chapter dark unless we are willing to see why. And yet the real darkness is still deeper than the blows themselves. The deepest darkness is the theology behind them. What sort of ruler imagines he can correct worship through mutilation? What sort of kingdom thinks truth can be manufactured by pain? What sort of public world stands around and learns from the spectacle of wounded righteousness? That is the layer I do not want to lose tonight. Because bodily violence is horrifying, yes, but in one Meqabyan, it is horrifying precisely because it is not random. It is ordered, intentional, liturgical in the worst possible sense. The king means the suffering to become an altar of fear. That is why this reading matters so much for retention of the story. If we reduce it to brutality, the mind recoils and floats away. But if we keep naming what the brutality is trying to do, the listener stays locked to the title promise. This is the darkest chapter because it reveals the inside of persecution. It shows how evil thinks. It shows the logic of a throne that cannot bear upright men. Imagine the scene, not as cinematic excess, not as a loud movie, as an old, severe witnessing. Hands tied, bodies driven into pain, officials close by. Watchers learning what power does to those who remain loyal elsewhere. And within it all, a steadiness the king cannot understand. That is what would have infuriated him most. Not simply that the men refused at the beginning, but that even after the punishments began, they still belonged inwardly to another kingdom. There is something else here that the chapter quietly reveals. Violence always tells on itself. A ruler can claim dignity. A court can claim order. A kingdom can claim necessity. But when the righteous must be torn down physically in order to defend the king's gods, the emptiness of those gods is already exposed. The very need for such force is confession. It tells us the idols have no breath of their own. They require the lungs of empire. They need soldiers, cords, sticks, whips, and fire because they cannot command love. They can only demand performance. That is why the martyrs become so dangerous precisely while suffering. Not dangerous in military terms, dangerous in revelatory terms. They expose the weakness of the whole idolatrous order. Their wounded bodies say, more clearly than speeches ever could, that the king's worship cannot persuade the conscience. If it could, there would be no need for this. And still, the text does not pretend that this witness is painless. I want to be careful here. Sometimes religious storytelling can become too eager to skip from pain to triumph. But one Meqabyan does not move that way. It lets the body remain a body. It lets the cruelty feel cruel. It lets the listener know that standing for what is holy may lead through terror before vindication ever appears. That honesty is one reason the chapter feels older and truer than polished inspirational speech. It does not promise that fidelity will look beautiful while it is happening. It promises only that fidelity remains fidelity, even when the world makes it costly. And now, weary soul, we are close to the center. Because the punishments are not the end of this movement, the king is not finished escalating. False worship almost never is. When one level of pain does not break the righteous, it reaches for another. And in this chapter, that next reach is fire. Before we go there, I want to say one thing plainly. The darkest parts of sacred history do not ask us to admire suffering itself. They ask us to see what kind of love makes suffering unable to dictate worship. That is the line being drawn here. That is the line the king cannot erase. And that is why the chapter keeps tightening instead of resolving. The body has been beaten. The faithful have been made examples. But the king still has not gained what he truly wants. He has not gained inward consent. So the next scene must become even harsher. The old text is walking us toward the fire pit now, toward the place where the kingdom tries to let flame finish what pressure could not finish. And once the men enter that fire, you might expect the chapter to close over them, to let the darkness be final, to let the tyrant carry the night. But one Meqabyan is not done. Not with the fire, not with the king, and not with the strange justice that can still enter a room after midnight. Vulnerability break. Tender, softer. Before we go farther, weary soul, this is the kind of chapter that can touch the place in us that still does not know what to do with cruelty, especially the cruelty that seems deliberate, planned, enjoyed. There are nights when forgiveness feels less like a virtue and more like an impossible doorway. If that is where you are, you do not need to force anything tonight. Just stay near the story a little longer. We will keep walking. Fire changes the emotional scale of a chapter. Once flames enter, no listener doubts anymore that the story has reached its terrible center. The punishments before this were severe, but the fire pit carries a different finality. It is the king's declaration that nothing less than total destruction will answer faithful refusal. This is why the scene matters so much. Not only because it is frightening, but because it reveals what power does when even torture fails to produce worship. It burns. It seeks obliteration. It moves from correction to eradication. It says, in effect, if I cannot make you bow, I will remove your witness from the earth. And that is the furnace heart of this chapter. The king is no longer trying merely to pressure conscience. He is trying to erase it. The old text preserves the movement starkly. The honored men are cast toward the fire. They enter not as men who have negotiated terms, but as men who have already given their souls to Jah. That line matters immensely, because it tells us the real handoff does not happen at the edge of the flames. It happened inwardly, before the flames ever rose. The body arrives at the pit later than the soul arrived at surrender. The word used here is honored. The English rendering calls them honored men as they go into the fire. That matters because the text is already resisting the king's interpretation of the scene. To the tyrant, they are criminals of disobedience. To the sacred witness, they are honored. Historically, martyr traditions often work this way. Earthly shame is renamed under heaven's judgment. The place of execution becomes the place of testimony. And tonight that matters because the fire pit is not only a site of horror, it is a site of contradiction. The kingdom calls it defeat. The text refuses that verdict, and I will tell you honestly, that single reversal is part of what gives this chapter its strange spiritual strength. The flames are not denied, but neither are they allowed to define the men who enter them. Imagine the scene slowly. The gathered watchers, the heat before contact, the smell of burning material waiting to receive bodies, the ruler believing he has finally found a language strong enough to silence fidelity, and the faithful moving into the fire not because pain has become unreal, but because worship has already been settled elsewhere. That is one of the deepest lessons in old martyr literature. Courage is not the absence of dread. It is a prior decision about who is God. Once that decision is made, all later terrors, however intense, arrive second. They remain real, but they are no longer first. This is why the chapter retains such grip. The conflict is not complicated here, and that simplicity is powerful. On one side, a ruler whose world depends on visible domination. On the other, men who have already handed over the center of themselves to the Most High. That is why the fire feels so decisive. It is the king's last argument in material form. Flame is what power reaches for when it has run out of persuasion, out of humiliation, out of delay. It wants one overwhelming sign that the body belongs to the throne. But the throne is too late. The body may be seized. The soul has already been entrusted. They always imagine intensity will solve what lesser pressure could not solve. If the rod did not work, fire will work. If threat did not work, terror will work. If public shaming did not work, annihilation will work. That is the escalating fantasy of evil. That one more degree of force will finally command what only truth and love can command. An old scripture keeps exposing that fantasy as hollow. Again and again. Evil overreaches because it cannot understand the soul. That is where the sacred dignity of the martyrs grows brighter, even in darkness. Their witness is not simply that they endure pain. It is that the king's imagination of absolute power is false. He can burn. He cannot own. He can kill. He cannot interpret the meaning of the death for heaven. The text claims that right away. It takes the scene away from him even while he presides over it. That is astonishing narrative strength. And yet, I do not want to speak of the fire too cleanly, too triumphantly, because if we make martyrdom sound easy, we betray the witness we are trying to honor. The chapter is dark because the burning is terrible, because the men really are given over, because faithfulness here costs everything visible. That is why this cannot become decorative speech. The flames are not metaphor. They are the king's fullest cruelty. Still, fire is not the end of the movement. That is what makes one Meqabyan so haunting. The chapter does not stop at martyrdom. It does not let the smoke become the final image. Instead, it carries the story into the hours after the execution, into the vulnerable territory of night, into the chamber where power expects to recover itself in sleep. This is a brilliant and terrifying turn, because tyrants often trust the night. They trust that darkness will swallow what the day has done. They trust that once the bodies are gone, rest will return. They trust that their own beds still belong to them. But this chapter is about to violate that confidence. The fire pit looks like an ending. It is not an ending. It is a threshold. The king has sent the righteous into the flame. Now the text will send their witness after him. Not into the court, not into a public square, into the privacy of the night, into the very place where he imagined he could be untroubled. And that is why I think the fire pit is not merely one of the darkest scenes. It is the hinge of the whole chapter. Before it, the king acts outwardly. After it, judgment starts moving inward. Before it, the violence is visible. After it, the terror becomes intimate. Before it, he uses the body to preach fear. After it, the dead preach to him. So keep the flames in your mind. Keep the honored men entering them. Keep the king watching, because the next scene does not take us away from this darkness. It takes the darkness with us, straight into the room where the ruler lies down, believing the night will still obey him. And that is where the chapter becomes unforgettable. Now the chapter does something extraordinary. It leaves the public scene. It leaves the execution ground. It leaves the spectacle of power. And it follows the king home. This is one of the reasons I believe this is the true dark heart of Meqabyan. The text is not satisfied to show cruelty in daylight. It wants to show what happens after cruelty has tried to settle down. It wants to know whether a man like Te Rutsaidan can sleep, and its answer is severe. The English rendering preserves the moment with unforgettable sharpness. Later that night, as the king lay in bed, the 5 martyrs appeared before him, standing and vexing him with swords. That image alone could carry the whole title, not because it is sensational, but because it is exact. The chapter does not say vaguely that he felt bad. It does not tell us only that guilt troubled his dreams. It gives him a visitation. The dead are no longer absent. The room is no longer his. Think about what that means structurally. Te Rutsaidan has been managing space. He arranged the kingdom. He raised images. He seized bodies. He turned roads and punishments into instruments of control. But now the control collapses in the smallest possible place. His own bedchamber. The room where no audience is needed. The room where robes come off. The room where a king is only a man lying in the dark. That is where the chapter chooses to strike. And it is a brilliant choice. Because if judgment entered the court, he could still posture. If it entered the public square, he could still command a response. But in bed, in darkness, a ruler has almost nothing left except himself. And the self is exactly what this chapter wants exposed. The word used here is bed. That seems simple, but it matters. The bed is the furniture of private confidence. It is where one expects the body to release its guarding. It is where the day is supposed to lose its grip. Historically and spiritually, night scenes in Scripture often function as moments of unveiling dreams, visitations, reckonings, divine interruption. And tonight that matters, because Te Rutsaidan's bed becomes the place where apparent closure is revoked. The fire did not finish the story. His lying down does not finish the story. The chapter follows him into rest and denies him ownership of it. And I will tell you honestly, that is the moment in Meqabyan I cannot hear casually. It feels too precise, too morally intelligent. The very place where he expects silence becomes the place where witness stands upright. The martyrs appear with swords. Again. The text is stark. It does not soften the image. The same king who used violence outwardly now sees violence mirrored back toward him, not as crude revenge, but as terror entering conscience. The sword here is not just a weapon. It is exposure. It is the shape judgment takes when the powerful can no longer hide behind procedure. And notice this too. They are standing. That detail matters. The men whom the king meant to reduce, break, and erase are now upright before him. The chapter visually reverses the whole story. He who sat enthroned is now the troubled one. Those whom he cast down are now vertical in his presence. That reversal is not accidental. It is theology in image form. The righteous stand. The tyrant lies down and still finds no peace. This is why the scene carries such AVD strength. It does not merely continue the story. It rehooks the listener at the deepest possible point. Just when one might assume the martyrdom was the end, the chapter opens a second darkness. Not the darkness of fire now, but the darkness of the room. The darkness in which the dead are nearer than sleep. The darkness in which power cannot call for help from its own certainty. I imagine the king startled awake, breath shortened, the old confidence gone thin in an instant. The chamber walls suddenly useless. Servants too far away. Authority too slow. No decree strong enough for this moment. That is part of the genius of the text. It does not need to give us a long speech from the king. The image itself does the work. A persecutor is forced to receive in private what he produced in public. There is also something profoundly biblical about the scene's moral symmetry. The ruler tried to turn the faithful into examples. Now, they become his example. He tried to instruct the people through terror. Now terror instructs him. He imagined death would end their witness. Instead, it intensifies it. That is not random horror. That is literary judgment. That is sacred narrative, refusing to let evil interpret itself. And yet the power of the scene does not depend on whether we read it as literal apparition, vision, night terror, or divinely sent haunting. The chapter's force remains either way. The point is that the king is not allowed moral distance from what he has done. The night closes the gap. The dead stand where memory can no longer be managed. This is what the chapter wanted from the beginning. Not simply to condemn cruelty, but to deny cruelty the luxury of inner peace. That is why I would never treat as a gimmick. It is too deeply tied to the chapter's theology. The bedchamber scene tells us something essential about God's world. Violence does not become clean simply because it becomes private afterward. A man may finish the execution. He may dismiss the crowd. He may darken the room. But the moral reality of what he has done remains standing. This is the point where many listeners will feel the title fully land. Not in the images alone. Not in the seizure alone. Not even in the fire alone. Here, at the bed, at the hour when the king hoped nothing else would happen. That is the darkest chapter. A chapter that will not let the persecutor sleep. But even now, one Meqabyan is not finished showing how creation itself refuses the king's interpretation. The next movement widens the frame once more, not back to the court, but out into a larger witness, because the righteous are not only answered by night visitations, they are answered by the world around them. And what happens next is one of the strangest details in the whole story. The beasts themselves refuse the tyrant's logic. They do not complete his sentence. They do something else, something quieter, something almost liturgical. And that next detail makes the whole chapter feel even older and even more alive. There are moments in ancient sacred literature when the natural world suddenly becomes a witness, not decorative background, not scenery, a witness. And one Meqabyan gives us one of those moments. The beasts are brought near the martyrs. They roar. Everything in the scene suggests that the kingdom expects one more layer of terror, one more public proof that the righteous can be humiliated, consumed, and reduced to fear. But the story breaks in another direction. As the animals come toward the martyrs, they hail them. They bow to them. That is an astonishing image, not only because it is strange, but because it answers the whole moral architecture of the chapter. The king has built a world of counterfeit reverence. He has raised images and demanded bowing. He has attempted to script what worship should look like. And then, at the edge of his cruelty, creation itself performs the right response. Not to idols, to the faithful. This detail matters far more than it may first seem, because it tells us the chapter is not interested only in private spirituality. It is interested in order. Right order. Disordered kingship has filled the kingdom with false gestures, but the beasts, who have no stake in flattering the court, become accidental theologians. They reveal the lie by refusing to enact it. The king wants domination. Creation gives recognition. The king wants the righteous made low. The beasts acknowledge them. The word used here is bowed. That matters because bowing has been one of the central tensions of the entire narrative. Who bows? Before what? Under whose authority? In the chapter's corrupted public world, bowing has become a demanded gesture of false worship. But here the movement is purified. The animals bow not as coerced subjects, but as unwilling participants in truth. Historically, scenes like this in martyr traditions often signal that creation recognizes what fallen power does not. The natural world becomes a mirror of divine order when human governments have gone crooked. And tonight, that matters because this chapter is no longer only about a king and his victims. It is about a universe that does not finally agree with the king. And I will tell you honestly, this is one of the details that makes the whole book feel impossible to forget once it is heard slowly. The beasts do not finish the persecution. They interrupt its meaning. There is deep comfort in that, though it must remain title-faithful comfort, not generic softness. This is not the chapter wandering away from its darkness. This is the chapter telling us that darkness is not the largest thing in the scene. Even in the midst of cruelty, there remain signs that reality has not been fully conquered by the tyrant's imagination. The king may rule the court. He does not rule creation's final testimony. Imagine the shock of it. Officials expecting one outcome. Spectators bracing for further horror. The animals arriving with noise and force. And then, something changes. The expected violence gives way to recognition. The line of fear is broken. The script the tyrant wrote is no longer being followed. This is one of the most powerful kinds of miracle in old texts. Not spectacle for spectacle's sake, but interruption. A reminder that evil does not own every actor in the story. It is also a humiliation of the king more profound than direct rebellion might have been. If men refuse him, he can punish men. If beasts refuse the meaning he wants, what can he do? He cannot whip the created order into permanent agreement. He cannot legislate moral truth. He cannot make the world call holy what heaven has not called holy. That is what the bowed beasts reveal. He is weaker than he appeared, and the world is less available to his control than he imagined. After the bodily severity and the bedchamber terror, we need not a drop in intensity, but a widening in scale. The chapter obliges. It moves from persecution to haunting to cosmic contradiction, and that widening keeps the story alive. It prevents the darkness from becoming monotonous. Now we see that the conflict is not only within human politics, it has reached into the grammar of creation itself. That is why martyr stories often include this kind of reversal. They are not merely recording pain. They are revealing what the pain could not finally alter. The rightness of the righteous remains intact. So intact, in fact, that even creatures without moral language become carriers of witness. The bowing beasts say what the chapter has been saying all along. These men were not wrong to remain upright. The tyrant was wrong to demand their bending. And perhaps there is another layer too. The animals do what many humans in the kingdom would not do. They offer the gesture to the right place. That contrast cuts deeply. Public life under idolatry had trained people into distorted reverence. But the beasts, untrained by propaganda, become truer than the polished court. There is something almost devastating in that thought. Creation may see more clearly than the human system that calls itself civilized. By now, the chapter has given us nearly every register of darkness. Image, pressure, seizure, punishment, fire, night terror. And now, within all that, a strange note of order returning from outside the king's reach. That note matters because it prepares us for interpretation. Why is this the darkest chapter? What kind of darkness is it actually showing us? Not just violent darkness. Not just political darkness. Something deeper. Something more theological. Because if we stop here, we may still misunderstand the chapter. We may think the darkest part is simply that terrible things happened. But sacred texts are usually more exact than that. Their darkness lies in what terrible things reveal about worship, about pride, about judgment, about what sort of world we are living in when a ruler tries to seize God's place and fails. So let the bowed beasts remain in your mind for a moment. Let them stand there, strange and unforgettable, because the next movement is not another scene of action. It is a reckoning, a naming, a slow answer to the question the title has been asking from the beginning. What makes this chapter the darkest in Meqabyan? And why does Ethiopian memory preserve such a night at all? We have reached the place where the story asks to be named, not rushed onward, not softened too early. Named because by now the chapter has shown us enough severity that the listener deserves more than mood. The listener deserves a clear answer. Why is this the darkest chapter of Meqabyan? It is not merely because men are beaten. Ancient texts contain beatings elsewhere. It is not merely because men are burned. Secret history has other fires. It is not even only because the dead appear beside a king's bed, though that image is unforgettable. The darkness here is deeper than any one scene. It is the darkness of worship being attacked at its root. That is the center. This chapter is darkest because a ruler does not only want obedience, he wants reverence. He wants to occupy the place in human life that belongs to God alone. Everything else unfolds from that theft. The images, the pressure, the punishments, the fire, all of it is downstream from a deeper blasphemy. A man on a throne, imagining that conscience can be reorganized around his will. That is why the violence feels so spiritually heavy. If the issue were only political disagreement, the chapter would remain harsh but smaller. But this is liturgical violence. It is violence aimed at worship. The body is targeted because the soul cannot be directly reached. The king hopes pain will do what truth cannot do for him. He hopes fear will produce adoration. That is what makes the chapter feel almost bottomless at times. It is evil misunderstanding the human person at the deepest possible level. The word I want to place here is vanity. Not superficial vanity only, but biblical vanity. Emptiness swollen with importance. The sort of emptiness that must constantly defend itself. That matters, because Tserut Sidon's whole kingdom is built on vanity. His images are vain. His demand is vain. His confidence that fire can settle the matter is vain. Even his bed becomes a theater of vanity exposed. Historically, one of the recurring themes associated with Meqabyan in secondary summaries is the vanity of earthly power before God. And tonight that matters because the chapter is not only about suffering saints. It is equally about a throne being revealed as hollow. And I will tell you honestly, that is what keeps the story from becoming despairing for me. The darkness is severe, but it is not sovereign. The chapter keeps stripping sovereignty away from the wrong place. There is a second reason this chapter deserves the title. It is dark because it refuses sentimental religion. It does not pretend that faithfulness protects the body from harm in every moment. It does not hurry to a clean, earthly rescue. The righteous here are not spared the seizure, not spared the beatings, not spared the fire. That honesty is difficult, but it is spiritually serious. It tells the truth about what false power may do for a time. And because it tells the truth, its later reversals carry more weight. The bedchamber visitation matters because the flames were not denied. The bowed beasts matter because the violence was real. The witness has authority because it passed through terror without becoming false. A third reason lies in the structure itself. The chapter invades every sphere. Public religion is corrupted. Private conscience is tested. Bodies are violated. Night is troubled. Creation is drawn in. Very few chapters manage to widen so completely. That is part of why it lingers. It does not confine darkness to one arena. It asks whether evil can take the court, the road, the body, the bed, and the world around them. And then it answers, slowly, not completely, not finally, not even when the king thinks he has done enough. This is also why Ethiopian memory preserving Meqabyan matters. Because a chapter like this is not kept merely for novelty, it is kept because it tells the truth about power and worship in a way later readers still need. The Meqabyan books are not simply duplicates of the better-known Greek Maccabean accounts. They carry their own theological texture and narrative force within the Ethiopian canon tradition. That distinct preservation matters for script writing too. It means tonight's darkness is not imported from elsewhere. It arises from the particular witness of this book as Ethiopia remembered and housed it. That makes the chapter not just dramatic, but located, preserved, received. That is one reason it feels so alive. It was not merely written once. It was carried, and perhaps that is the fourth reason this chapter is so dark. It is dark because it knows how easily human beings can be trained into false reverence. That may be the most unsettling feature of all. The tyrant is wicked. Yes, but the chapter never lets us imagine that the problem belongs only to one monstrous man. His kingdom has space for his images. His court has habits that support him. His public world can be instructed by fear. That means the chapter is not only condemning one ruler, it is warning every age. It is asking, what happens whenever societies begin rewarding public gestures of hollow worship? That is not an ancient problem only. That is a permanent one. And yet, for all its darkness, the chapter is not hopeless. That distinction matters before we near the sleep transition later on. The story is not hopeful because the pain was small. It was not. It is hopeful because the king never truly owns the meaning of the chapter. He can command the punishments. He cannot command the truth. He can light the fire. He cannot make the honored men dishonored before God. He can lie down in bed. He cannot keep witness from standing over him. He can summon beasts. He cannot make creation agree with his lies. That is the deep reassurance hidden inside the severity. Not broad therapy, not generic comfort, text-born reassurance. The throne of evil is loud, but not ultimate. This is why I think the chapter belongs in a Pastor Michael Knight study, because it allows us to be honest about dread without handing dread the crown. It allows us to look directly at a dark page and still say that reality is larger than the tyrant's imagination. That is mature comfort. Comfort that emerges from the text rather than replacing it. So, if someone asked me, very simply, why this is Meqabyan's darkest chapter, I would answer this way. Because it shows a ruler trying to steal worship, break conscience through suffering, and then hide from judgment in the night, only to discover that neither martyrdom nor darkness can make false power final. And that leaves us with one last question, before the teaching portion begins to loosen. Why would the Ethiopian Bible keep such a chapter near? Why preserve a knight this severe, a ruler this hollow, a witness this costly? That is where we go next. Not into new horrors now, but into custody, into canon, into the reason a community would continue carrying a page like this through centuries of prayer. And once we ask that question, we will be standing very near the place where the study begins to release the body into rest. After a chapter like this, a natural question rises. Why keep it? Why would a believing community preserve a night so severe, a ruler so hollow, a witness so costly, and a scene so unsettling that even the bed of a king becomes a place of judgment? That question matters, Because sacred communities do not carry texts forever by accident. They keep what continues to tell the truth. And the Ethiopian Bible's keeping of Meqabyan belongs to that deeper kind of truthfulness. Not curiosity alone, not novelty alone, not the thrill of having an unusual book on a larger shelf, but the recognition that some chapters remain necessary because human power keeps repeating its old ambitions. The Meqabyan books, as Ethiopian tradition preserves them, are not simply the better-known Greek Meqabyan books in another costume. They belong to a distinct, textual, and canonical stream within the Ethiopian Orthodox world. That matters here, because one Meqabyan carries its own spiritual texture, its own severity, and its own way of exposing the vanity of earthly power before God. The canon memory of the Ethiopian Church left room for that witness, and I think that says something beautiful and demanding at the same time. It says there was wisdom enough to know that believers need more than comforting passages. They also need pages that tell the truth about false reverence, state violence, and the cost of remaining inwardly whole. Wikipedia, https://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/Meqabyan. Canon in the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewado Church, https www.intpapers. Anki %20. Wanger %20. The word used here is canon. In the life of the church, canon is not merely a list on paper. It is also a shaped memory, a received order, a way of saying, these are the books we continue hearing, praying, and carrying together. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewado tradition, the broader canon includes books many Western readers did not grow up hearing named regularly, and Meqabyan is among those distinctive witnesses. Historically, sources discussing the Ethiopian canon note that Meqabyan occupies a place in that preserved world, while remaining different from the familiar Greek and Latin Maccabees. And tonight that matters because this chapter is not a late internet rediscovery pretending to be ancient. It is part of a remembered, scriptural house. Canon in the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewado Church. https www.euclid.nt. Papers, Anki %20. Wanger %20, %20. Canon %20 inches, %20 %20 EOTC PDF. Wikipedia, https n.wikipedia.org/wiki/Meqabyan.a. And I will tell you honestly, there is something deeply moving to me in that thought. A page like this survived, not because it was easy to hear, but because someone believed hard truth should not be lost. That is one reason Ethiopia would keep such a chapter, because it unmasks power. And every age needs that. Every age has public images. Every age has rulers, systems, and atmospheres that want more than obedience. They want reverence. They want inward assent. They want public gestures that prove the soul has been brought into line. One Meqabyan does not let that ambition pass as normal politics. It names it for what it is, a theft attempted against worship itself. A community that understands the danger will not easily discard a book that names it so sharply. There is another reason too. The chapter teaches believers how to read suffering without lying. That is rare. Many religious voices are tempted either to romanticize martyrdom or to avoid it altogether. But one Meqabyan does neither. It lets pain remain pain. It allows the righteous to be seized, beaten, and burned. And yet it also insists that suffering does not transfer final meaning to the persecutor. That is a mature theology. A church that wants to form souls capable of truth-telling would have reason to keep a page like this near. And then there is the Ethiopian instinct of custody itself. One of the most beautiful things about the broader canon conversation is that preservation is never merely academic. Texts survive because somebody copies them, reads them, hears them, hands them on, and refuses to let them vanish into silence. That kind of custody is humble, but it is powerful. It says memory matters. It says the loss of a witness is no small thing. It says that if a book still speaks into the temptations of pride, fear, idolatry, and courage, then the community should not hurry to set it aside. That is how I hear Meqabyan tonight. Not as a museum item, not as a dramatic oddity, but as a text whose severity belongs to pastoral honesty. It speaks to the believer who must live under pressure. It speaks to the soul who has seen cruelty and wonders whether cruelty can ever really sleep in peace. It speaks to the church that must teach its people the difference between public pressure and true reverence. And perhaps, most quietly of all, it speaks to the weary listener who needs to remember that the throne of evil may be loud without ever being final. This is where the Ethiopian keeping of the text becomes especially meaningful, because a chapter like this helps preserve moral proportion. It tells the faithful not to confuse force with truth, not to confuse spectacle with authority, not to confuse a king's ability to wound with his ability to define reality. That is precious teaching, and I think communities who have endured long histories of pressure often recognize the value of such teaching more quickly than comfortable cultures do. They know that canon is not only about information, it is about formation. The name Feteha Negest, often associated with the legal and canonical memory of Christian Ethiopia, means Law of the Kings. There is a quiet irony in hearing that title beside tonight's chapter, because one Meqabyan is also about the Law of Kings in another sense. What kind of ruler imagines he can reorder worship? What kind of sovereignty swells until it thinks conscience belongs to the throne? And what kind of higher judgment exposes that swelling as vanity? That is one reason the chapter fits so naturally inside a long tradition of remembered sacred order. It is not only a story about the wickedness of one king, it is a warning to every kingly impulse in human life. Canon in the Ethiopian Orthodox Tawado Church, https www.nt. Papers Anki, %20. Wanger, %20. %20. Canon, %20. Inches, %20. The %20 EOTC. PDF. By now, we have followed the chapter through image, pressure, seizure, beating, fire, haunting, and bowed beasts. We have named why it is dark, and now we have named why it was kept. What remains is not more information. What remains is release. The teaching has done its work. The story has spoken with enough force. The listener does not need another chamber of analysis. The listener needs a place where the chapter can stop pressing on the mind and begin settling into the body. That is where we are going next. Not away from the story as though it had nothing more to give, but beyond its active labor. The study is nearly done. Weary soul, the old text has spoken. The righteous have stood. The king has not slept in peace. The beasts have bowed. And now, the room can soften. Now the voice can lower. Now the body can be permitted to stop keeping intellectual watch. Because from this point on, we are not asking you to carry the chapter. We are going to let it rest where it belongs. The lesson has been given. The witness has been heard. And what comes next is only quiet, only breath. Only the gentle release into a place where no false image can follow you. Let the teaching settle into your bones now, weary soul. The study is done. The chapter has said what it came to say. It has shown you the images, the pressure, the faithful men, the fire, the bed, the bowed beasts, and the hollow throne that could not make itself final. You do not need to hold any of it tightly anymore. From this moment, only the voice, only the quiet, only the soft lowering from thought into rest. You are leaving the king's chamber now, leaving the road, leaving the fire, leaving the startled night in which judgment stood at the bedside of power. You do not need to stay there. The story can remain true without you carrying its full weight into sleep. Imagine instead that you are walking very slowly away from all of it, away from stone corridors, away from the rooms where cruel men made their plans, away from every raised image, every command, every threat. And as you walk, the night grows gentler, the air changes, the ground softens beneath your steps. Ahead of you is a walled garden, old stone around it, warm from the day, though the evening has now fully come. The gate is open. No one is chasing you. No one is asking anything from you. There is only the hush of a protected place receiving you. Step inside. The wall is high enough to keep out noise. The path is smooth. The stone beneath your feet holds the last memory of warmth. Small leaves barely move in the quiet air. Somewhere above, evening birds are settling into their own hidden rest, not calling sharply now. Only the last soft notes of a day that has already finished its labor. Let that be enough. The day has finished its labor. The chapter has finished its labor. You do not need to produce one more thought tonight. If the scenes we walk through still glow a little at the edge of your mind, let them dim naturally. Do not force them away. Do not wrestle them down. Let them become distant, like lamplight behind a closing door, like voices from another courtyard, now far beyond the garden wall. The stone bench near you is still warm. You can sit if you like, or remain standing for a moment, feeling the gentle safety of enclosure. This is not a place of argument, not a place of proving, not a place where any image asks for your bowing. Nothing hollow is raised here. Nothing false needs your fear. Only the night, only the garden, only the small faithful sounds of settling life. Let the shoulders lower. Let the jaw loosen. Let the eyes become heavy without resistance. Let the hands forget their old tightening. Let the chest remember that breathing does not need instructions now. It already knows. It has known since before you were old enough to worry. And if some part of you still feels responsible to remain awake, responsible to keep watch, responsible to think one more useful thought, let that responsibility ease away. There is nothing left for you to guard tonight. The study is over. The gate is closed behind you. The garden is enough. From here, we will move more slowly still. No new teaching, no new scenes, only rest, only warm stone, evening birds, and the quiet mercy of a place where the soul does not have to defend itself. So stay here now, inside the wall, under the soft dark, with the last warmth of the day still held in the stones around you, and let the voice carry you the rest of the way. The wall around the garden does not feel severe. It does not feel like confinement. It feels like mercy given shape, a boundary that asks nothing from you except that you come inside and stop carrying so much. You are inside now. The gate is somewhere behind you, but already it feels far enough away that you do not need to turn and check it. Nothing is pursuing you. Nothing is calling your name in urgency. Nothing is demanding one more explanation, one more effort, one more piece of strength. The garden has accepted your arrival without questions. That is one of the gentlest things about it. You do not have to announce yourself here. You do not have to prove that you deserve rest. The space receives you as though it had expected you all along. Along the wall, small plants keep their places in the evening hush. Leaves rest against old stone. The stone has taken in heat all day, and now, as night deepens, it gives that warmth back very slowly. Not enough to notice sharply, only enough to make the air close to the wall feel kinder. Kinder than the open ground, kinder than the spaces where people are always watched, measured, judged, or hurried along. This place is not in a hurry. Nothing here is in a hurry. The garden is old enough to trust the night. The wall is old enough to hold quiet, without strain. The path is old enough to remember many slow footsteps before yours. And now it receives yours as well, without surprise, without impatience, without asking where you have been too long. If you are walking, walk slowly. If you are sitting, let your weight settle. If you are already beginning to drift, then simply drift. The garden knows what to do with a tired soul. It does not treat tiredness as failure. It treats tiredness as something that needs softness. Somewhere above the wall, a branch moves just enough to let a few leaves whisper against one another. Not enough to disturb you, only enough to remind you that even stillness can have its own small music. There may be one last bird note from a hidden place, then silence, then another soft note, then silence again. The kind of evening sound that does not keep you awake, but gently convinces the body it is safe to let go. Your breathing can follow those small intervals if it wants. A breath, a pause, another breath, a little more release. No need to make it perfect, no need to count. Only let the rhythm become easy. Let the chest rise and fall as naturally as the leaves settling against warm stone. The wall, for all its quiet strength, is not imposing itself on you. It is simply there, holding the line between this gentle inner place and the harsher outer world. There have been hours in life when you needed openness, when you needed a wide horizon, when you needed the long distance to clear your mind. But tonight, what you need is enclosure. Not pressure, enclosure. A held place. A place where the edges are known, and because the edges are known, the body can stop scanning. That is one of the mercies of a walled garden. Your nervous system does not need to remain posted at every boundary. The boundary is already there. You do not have to become the wall. You do not have to perform vigilance. You can simply rest within what has already been prepared. Perhaps there is a stone bench not far from you, its surface still gently warm. Perhaps a narrow basin of water rests in some quiet corner, not making much sound, just enough for an occasional soft touch of movement against itself. Perhaps the scent of earth is faintly rising now that the daytime heat has gone. Nothing dramatic, only the mild breath of ground cooling under evening. And because nothing dramatic is happening, your body can begin believing that nothing dramatic is about to happen. That belief matters. The body is often slow to trust good news. It has lived through too many sharp hours, too many interruptions, too many unfinished things. So let the garden teach it slowly. No sudden lessons, no forced peace, only repetition. Warm stone, quiet wall, soft leaves, evening birds settling. Warm stone again, quiet wall again. No urgency, no demand. If thoughts still come, let them come more softly. They do not have to disappear all at once. They can pass through like late birds crossing over the top of the wall, seen for a moment, then gone. You do not have to follow them. You do not have to turn them into plans. They are only passing things now. The garden does not require you to pick them up. Sometimes the mind keeps working because it believes its work is an act of care. If it stops, something will go wrong. If it loosens, something will be lost. But not here. The garden is teaching another kind of care. The care of release. The care of being held by a place that is not asking you to manage it. The wall does not need your help to stand. The evening does not need your help to deepen. The birds do not need your help to grow quiet. And your body, if you let it, knows how to move towards sleep without being argued into it. That is why the pace is slow now. Not because nothing is happening, but because the most important thing is happening quietly. The body is letting go of unnecessary labor. The shoulders are learning they do not need to remain half lifted. The forehead is learning it does not need to tighten around old thoughts. The tongue can rest in the mouth. The hands can unclench completely. The legs do not need to prepare for movement. There is nowhere else to go tonight. You have already reached the garden. Along the wall, the last stored warmth continues to rise in the smallest way. You may not even feel it directly. You may only notice that the air here does not ask the body to brace itself. It is a forgiving air, the kind that lets the breath lengthen by itself, the kind that lets the eyes grow heavy without fear, the kind that tells the muscles, softly and repeatedly, there is no need for alarm now. If you like, you can imagine resting one hand against the stone, not because you need proof that it is real, but because touch can be calming in its own quiet way. The surface is firm. It does not tremble. It does not demand anything from your hand. It only stays what it is. There is something deeply restful in contact with what does not demand performance. The wall does not need you to be impressive. The bench does not need you to be brave. The garden does not need you to explain your tiredness. It only asks that you remain long enough for stillness to become believable again. And perhaps, as the minutes deepen, you notice how sound changes inside a protected space. The outer world feels farther away. Whatever noise still exists beyond the wall arrives softened, stripped of its power to enter sharply. Within the garden, every sound is small. A leaf shifting, a light brush of air, a hidden bird settling one last time, the tiny movement of your own breathing. That is enough sound for this hour. Enough life. Enough company. If sleep is already touching you, you do not need to resist it out of politeness to the voice. You do not need to remain alert in order to finish the sentences. The wall will still be here. The stone will still be warm a little longer. The garden will keep holding its shape, whether you hear every word or not. Nothing is lost by drifting now. Nothing valuable depends on your full attention anymore. The work has shifted from listening to receiving. So receive. Receive the shelter. Receive the enclosure. Receive the gentle fact that you are no longer in the open. Receive the warmth held in old stone. Receive the evening's patient dark. Receive the last small notes of birds turning quiet above you. Receive the mercy of not having to finish the day in your own strength. And if your mind asks again what comes next, let the answer be simple. Nothing urgent, only deeper quiet, only more settling, only the garden continuing to be what it already is. A place where the body can stop standing guard. A place where the soul can stop arguing with the night. A place where even tiredness is received gently. Stay here, inside the wall, near the warmth, under the soft, dark. Let the path blur a little. Let the edges soften. Let the distinction between one breath and the next become less important. Let the birds be almost gone now. Let the garden do what it was made to do. Hold you, quietly, completely, without strain. Now let almost everything fall away except the stone. The warm stone beneath you, or beside you, or near enough to imagine clearly. Stone that spent the day quietly receiving light. Stone that is not bright now, not hot now, only softly warm, as though the day left behind just enough kindness for the night to use. There is something deeply trustworthy about warmth stored in stone. It is not hurried warmth, not a flash, not a flame. not anything that startles the body. It is gathered warmth, held warmth, released slowly enough that the skin does not feel asked to react, only invited to soften. If you are sitting, feel the support beneath you. If you are lying down, imagine the warmth close to your side, close to the wall, close to the place where the garden keeps the day's memory a little longer. Nothing is rushing away. The warmth is patient. It knows how to leave gently, and because it leaves gently, your body can learn from it. There is no need to release all at once, no need to collapse, only a slow easing, a slow softening, a slow unwinding of the places that stayed ready for too long. Warm stone has a way of quieting the mind because it asks for so little interpretation. It does not need to be figured out. It only needs to be felt. Perhaps that is why old places of rest often keep company with stone. Stone walls, stone courtyards, stone benches, stone steps cooling after sun. They do not perform comfort loudly. They offer it steadily, and steady comfort is what tired bodies trust most. Let your attention settle there now. Not on tomorrow, not on anything unfinished, not on whether sleep is coming quickly enough, only on the fact of warmth near you, a simple kindness preserved in matter, the last echo of daylight not yet gone. That is enough for this moment, enough to receive, enough to feel the body becoming less defended. The shoulders may already be lower than before, the face may already be softer. The small muscles around the eyes may already be giving up their last little efforts. Even the mouth can rest more completely now. The tongue can be still. The throat can stop holding any invisible conversation. The chest can move without supervision. The belly can rise and fall without being corrected. Everything that has been trying to help can begin to understand that help is no longer needed. The stone is doing what it can. The night is doing what it can. The garden is doing what it can. You do not have to add another layer of work. The stone is doing what it can. The night is doing what it can. The garden is doing what it can. You do not have to add another layer of work. There may be a place where your hand could rest beside you, palm open, not gripping, not curled, just resting near the warm surface. An open hand teaches the body something that words sometimes cannot teach. It teaches that the hour of holding is over. Nothing is being taken from you. Nothing is slipping through your fingers. The open hand is safe here. The open jaw is safe here. The closed eyes are safe here. The slowed breath is safe here. And if some old vigilance still remains, let it be warmed loose the way evening warmth leaves stone by degrees. Not forced away, not shamed away, only gently outlasted. The night can outlast your vigilance. The garden can outlast your caution. The stone can outlast your last little bracing. You do not have to win a contest against your own wakefulness. You only have to remain long enough for gentleness to do its work. Somewhere nearby, a faint scent of earth may still be rising. The cooled sweetness of leaves after day. The quiet mineral breath of stone. Perhaps the memory of sun-warmed dust now turning mild. These are not strong smells, only small companions. The kind that keep the night from feeling empty. The kind that say, without language, this place has held many evenings before this one and knows how to carry another. That thought may help too. You are not asking the night to invent rest for the first time. Rest has always been one of its old skills. Night knows how to receive what day has tired. Stone knows how to keep warmth until the body is ready to believe it can soften. Gardens know how to hold quiet without making a display of it. Birds know how to stop calling one by one until only stillness remains. You are inside an order older than your worry, and because it is older, you do not have to manage it. The warmth in the stone continues. Less than before, perhaps, but enough. Always enough. Enough to keep the air kind. Enough to keep the imagination anchored in something gentle. Enough to make the body feel companioned by the place beneath and around it. Not alone, not exposed. Companioned. The wall near you, the bench near you, the path quiet nearby, the dark above held in peace. If any thought still asks whether you have done enough today, let the stone answer for you. Enough? If any part of you still fears what is unfinished, let the stone answer again. Enough. If the body wonders whether it is allowed to stop preparing, let the warmth say it once more. Enough. Sometimes sleep comes not when the mind is convinced, but when the body finally meets enough repetition of kindness, enough gentle signals, enough evidence that no threat is near, enough simple sensations that do not ask for analysis. Warmth, stillness, support, enclosure, soft dark. That is what the stone is offering by continuing to be exactly what it is. And so the stone becomes almost like a quiet teacher, though it never speaks. It teaches duration without urgency. It teaches release without collapse. It teaches that what is firm can also be kind, that what is lasting can also be gentle, that rest does not always arrive as softness first. Sometimes it arrives as support, and then slowly becomes softness from within. Perhaps now the path is blurring, and the details of the garden are less distinct. That is all right. You do not need a clear mental picture anymore. You only need the feeling of being in a safe place, close to warm stone, under a settled evening, with nothing left to prove. That feeling is enough. Even if the image is thin, the feeling can remain. Sometimes sleep prefers feeling to picture. Let it. The breath grows quieter. The muscles lower further. The heartbeat is no longer something to notice, only something happening faithfully in the background, like a hidden fountain too soft to hear clearly. The body knows more now than it did a little while ago. It knows the wall is not a threat. It knows the dark is kind. It knows the stone is warm. It knows no false image is raised over this place. It knows no harsh voice is coming through the gate. It knows there is no road to hurry down, no chamber to re-enter, no argument left to finish. Only this. Warm stone, slow night, a body growing heavier, in a good way. Eyes no longer interested in opening, hands happy to remain still. The small effort of being someone in the world, easing back for a while. Not forever, just for this night. That is enough. Let the warm stone hold the memory of daylight for you now, so you do not need to hold anything else. Let it keep that last quiet kindness. Let it release it slowly, while you release the day. Let everything grow simpler. Less thought, less edge, less effort, more weight, more softness, more settling. And if words themselves begin to feel far away, that is good. They have carried you far enough. Soon, only tone will matter. Soon, even tone may not matter much. Only the feeling of being safely near what is steady, near what is warm, near what asks nothing. Stay there, near the stone, near the lingering warmth, near the part of the night that has already decided to be gentle with you, and let that gentleness go on, slowly, steadily, until the mind no longer needs to remain at the front of your rest. Now, let the night become even lighter in its touch, not brighter, lighter, as though everything around you has learned how to settle without making a sound big enough to disturb your rest. The evening birds are almost quiet now. Almost. There may still be one small note from somewhere above the wall. Then silence. Then another note, softer than before, as though the bird itself is already half inside sleep. That is enough sound for this hour, enough to remind you that life can continue without urgency, enough to let the body know the world has chosen rest for a while. Bird song in the morning wakes things. Evening birds do something else. They close things gently. They gather the edges of the day inward. They say, in their own small way, that the labor is over, that movement can lessen, that even the air itself can stop carrying so many instructions. Listen as though you do not need to catch every sound, because you do not. It is enough to know the sounds are there. Soft, separate, widely spaced. No call urgent enough to ask anything from you. No burst of sound strong enough to bring the mind forward again. Only tiny signs of creatures tucking themselves into the night. A note here, a hush there, then a longer quiet, then perhaps one final answer from farther away, then almost nothing at all. The body often loves sounds like this. Not loud enough to alert, not patterned enough to demand counting. Just small natural evidence that the world is settling instead of rising. The birds are settling. The leaves are settling. The warmth in the stone is settling. Your breathing is settling. The thoughts can settle too. Nothing has to remain standing tonight except the quiet itself. If you like, you can imagine that each small bird note carries away one last thread of wakefulness. Not because the notes are magical, but because your body is ready to let go in little pieces. One note, and the forehead smooths a little more. One note, and the shoulders lower another degree. One note, and the breath becomes less interested in being noticed. One note, and the distance between thoughts widens. One note, and the body remembers that sleep is not a task. There is something holy in creatures knowing when to go quiet. No argument, no dramatic ending, no declaration, only a soft lessening, a surrender to darkness that is not defeat, but trust. The birds do not master the night. They yield to it, and perhaps the body can learn from them now, not by force, by imitation, a quiet, yielding, a little less listening outward, a little less searching, a little more resting within what has already become safe. The sounds grow fewer. That may be the loveliest part, the growing fewer. Not a sudden drop into silence, but a thinning, a spacing, a gentle honesty about endings. The day does not vanish all at once. It loosens. It stops speaking so often. It says less and less until finally the night can hold what remains without effort. Your thoughts can do the same. They do not have to disappear on command. They can simply say less, then less still, then almost nothing. Perhaps one bird is hidden in ivy on the far wall. Perhaps another is deeper in a tree beyond the corner path. Perhaps another has already folded itself into silence completely. You do not need to know where they are, only that they are near enough to make the night feel companioned and quiet enough to make the night feel safe. That balance matters. Completely empty spaces can sometimes make the body cautious, but a few gentle living sounds, widely spaced, softened by distance, can reassure the nervous system that the dark is inhabited by peace. You are not alone here, but neither are you being watched. There is life around you, but it is not leaning on you. It is only settling beside you. The birds are settling. The leaves are settling. The path is settling under shadow. The wall is settling deeper into its long patience. And your body, if it has not already, may begin to feel heavier, warmer, less interested in movement, less interested in thought, more willing to sink. A soft note above, a pause, another from farther back, then quiet again. That pattern is kind. It gives the mind nothing to solve. It gives the body permission to drift between sounds. And drifting between sounds is often very close to sleep. No need to arrive anywhere. Just the easy fading that happens when nothing urgent calls you back. The evening birds are nearly done now. And because they are nearly done, you may feel yourself nearly done as well. Nearly done carrying the outline of the day. Nearly done being alert to every inner movement. Nearly done holding language at the front of the mind. Soon there may be no need for sentences at all. Only tone. Only rhythm. Only the small cradle of natural sounds, disappearing one by one into a night that has room for everything to grow still. If one last thought rises, let it be simple. The birds are resting, and I can rest too. If another rises, let it be simpler still. The night is gentle. If another comes, let it dissolve before it even forms completely. No need to finish it. The birds are not finishing long songs anymore. They are offering fragments. The mind can offer fragments too, and then let even those fall silent. Long enough for the body to begin slipping into them. Long enough that the silence itself becomes the main thing, and the remaining notes are only small threads sewn into it. That is enough. Enough sound to keep the dark from feeling empty. Enough silence to let the body become heavy. Enough repetition to let the breath move on its own. Enough gentleness to let sleep come without being invited twice. You may not even notice the exact moment the birds stop. That is all right. The body does not need to record it. It only needs to be with the slow lessening. With the world becoming more and more willing to release the day. With each living thing drawing inward. With the final softness of a place where almost everything has already gone quiet. And perhaps that is what you are doing now too. Drawing inward. Not in fear. In peace. The body becoming less public. The mind becoming less exposed. The soul folding itself into the sheltered dark, the way a small bird folds itself into hidden leaves. Completely ordinary, completely safe, completely ready to stop. So let the evening birds teach the last lesson of the hour. Not a lesson for thought, a lesson for the body. How to say less, how to move less, how to remain where you are and become still enough for rest to find you. How to trust the dark when the dark has already proved itself kind. There may be one final note, very small, almost nothing, then quiet, then only your breathing, soft enough to belong with the leaves and the wall and the fading warmth in the stone. Then even the breathing may feel farther away, still happening, but no longer requiring your attention. That is good. That is enough. That is the night doing its old work very gently. Now there is almost nothing left to do. That may be the most restful sentence of the night. Almost nothing left to do. The wall is standing. The gate is closed. The stone is still holding a little warmth. The birds are quiet. The garden has taken the shape of full evening. And you, weary soul, do not have to keep watch over any of it. For so many people, weariness is not only tiredness, it is vigilance. It is the long habit of staying ready, ready to think, ready to answer, ready to brace, ready to return to the problem before the problem returns to you. That habit can become so familiar that rest feels almost irresponsible. But not here. Not now. Nothing in this garden requires your vigilance. You are allowed to be kept without keeping. Let those words sink slowly. Kept without keeping. Held without effort. Protected without performance. The wall keeps its place. The night keeps its hush. The garden keeps its gentle order. And you are inside that keeping, not outside it trying to maintain it. This is where the body can release its final secret efforts. The tiny watchfulness behind the eyes, the last thin grip in the jaw, the small readiness in the shoulders, the almost invisible, guarding in the belly, the habit in the legs of remaining prepared. One by one, without force, let them understand. The watch is over. There is nothing to patrol, nothing to prevent, nothing to carry across the threshold of sleep. If the mind still circles, let it circle more slowly, a wider circle, then wider still, until it is less a circle than a drifting, then less a drifting than a soft stillness. It does not have to land perfectly. It only has to become less insistent. The garden can do the rest. The night can do the rest. Your body can do the rest. Imagine that somewhere beyond the wall, far enough away not to matter, the world continues in its own way. Perhaps there are roads. Perhaps there are lights in distant places. Perhaps somewhere someone is still speaking, still moving, still finishing the day. But none of that belongs to you now. You are not required to remain connected to every moving thing. You are allowed to step out of the flow of effort. You are allowed to become still while the rest of the world continues without your supervision. That too is part of being kept. The bed or chair or place where you rest right now can become part of the garden. No need to hold a strict line between imagination and body. Let them meet. Let the warmth in the stone become warmth around you. Let the wall become the sense of shelter in the room. Let the evening birds become the last far softness at the edges of hearing. Let the whole garden settle gently over the real body, as though rest itself had chosen a form simple enough for you to trust. Kept without keeping. That is the phrase again. Softly, not as something to memorize, as something to feel. Kept without keeping. The heart beats without being told. The breath moves without being managed. The night deepens without being arranged. Sleep comes without being constructed. You do not need to become the maker of what has already been given. You only need to stop resisting what is gentle. Sometimes the last barrier to sleep is not noise. It is responsibility that has forgotten how to rest. If that is true tonight, let responsibility step back. Only for a few hours. It will still exist tomorrow if needed. But tonight, it can set down its tools. Tonight it can sit by the wall and grow quiet. Tonight it can trust that not everything depends on its wakefulness. That trust may feel small at first. Only a fraction more softness. Only a slightly deeper breath. Only a little more heaviness in the limbs. That is enough. Sleep often enters through small permissions. A permission not to answer the next thought. A permission not to reopen the day. A permission not to test whether you are relaxed enough yet. A permission to drift before you are certain you are drifting. The garden is still here. The wall is still here. The warm stone, fainter now, is still here. The evening birds are quiet. The path is almost gone into shadow. The leaves no longer need to move. Everything has entered the hour when staying is enough, and staying is enough for you too. No more striving to arrive. No more checking the distance. You are already where the night wanted to place you. So let the last inner sentry rest. Let the last little guard at the gate sit down. Let the last inward watcher close its eyes. Nothing harmful is entering. Nothing necessary is being missed. Nothing wholly depends on your tension. The kindest thing you can do now is nothing. Nothing except breathe. And even breathing does not need your effort anymore. Kept without keeping. Held without holding. Sheltered without building the shelter yourself. The night is good at this. The garden is good at this. The body, when allowed, is good at this too. There may be moments now when the words blur a little. Let them. There may be spaces when you hear less of the sentences and more of the tone. Let that happen. There may be small slips in attention, brief gaps, soft drifting. Those are not interruptions. They are signs that rest is already near. perhaps nearer than you think. Nothing left to prove, nothing left to guard, nothing left to solve. Only the quiet fact that you are being held through the night without needing to stay awake to help. And if the body wants sleep now, let it have sleep. Fully, gently, without apology, without one last effort, without even needing a final clear thought. The garden remains. The wall remains. The hush remains. And you, weary soul, may simply go down into rest. Very soft. Fade. And the story we entered tonight still lingers softly. Not to trouble you, not to keep you awake, only to stand far away now, like an old gate closed behind you, like a distant chamber that no longer asks anything of your mind or body. The king is gone from your room. The images are gone. The fire is gone. The hard road is gone. Even the bedchamber where judgment stood has gone dim and far. Only the quiet remains. Only the garden remains. Only the warm stone, the high wall, the evening birds now fully still, and the soft dark holding all of it together. The chapter has done its work. It told the truth. It kept faith with the righteous. It refused to let false power become final. That is enough. More than enough. You do not need to revisit it now. You do not need to rehearse its meanings. They can rest where they belong. The old witness can keep its own watch. You do not have to keep watch with it anymore. Let the garden keep you. Let the night receive you. Let the last little edges of awareness soften and drift. Let sleep come in the ordinary holy way it comes. Quietly, patiently, without show. If there is one last thought, let it be a gentle one. The night is kind. If there is one last feeling, let it be a simple one. I am safe. If there is one last movement, let it be downward, into stillness, into warmth, into rest. And if the voice grows farther now, that is good. It means you no longer need it close. It means the path has done what it came to do. It brought you inside the wall. It sat you beside the warm stone. It listened with you until the birds grew quiet. It remained until the last inward watcher set down its burden. And now, it can grow faint, because sleep is near enough to take over from here. So rest now, weary soul. Rest without keeping. Rest without fear. Rest without explanation. The garden is around you. The hush is over you. The night is deep and gentle, and you are held. Sleep now.